So last week I turned 30. It was great. I baked an Oreo cake. I had a stressful week. Life is just doing its thing as usual. But since it is a milestone year for me, I thought I wanted to mark it with an art skill upgrade. So today you are going to upgrade with me. So if you've been around this channel for a little bit, you know that the one thing I've always avoided painting is flowers. And if you haven't, hi, I'm Srish, and the one thing I've always avoided painting is flowers. That was until I figured out a brain hack that made me look at them in a completely different way. And the way I figured it out is by working on this painting. Now yes, this is very much still a work in progress, and I've only really got this flower mostly done. But as I say, art is a process and art is in the process, and boy has this process stunned me. Today, as we tackle my art nemesis together, I want to talk to you about a concept, a way of thinking really, that I like to call material transference. And the way we're going to learn this is by painting some flowers together. It'll change the way you look at rendering a whole bunch of objects, and I'm going to warn you now, watching this video is going to trip you out a little bit when you look at the rest of the world around you after, in a good way, I hope. Yeah. Anyway, if you're excited to see the world through a whole new pair of eyeballs, then make sure you give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Leave me a comment below, do all that cool stuff. It really helps me out with the algorithm. And without much further ado, let's dive into the wonderful world of material transference. The reason I struggled with painting flowers was primarily the petals. They are soft but firm, structured but pliable, colorful but translucent. You want to be able to put all these characteristics into the flower because that is what really sells the idea of it. It's when the petals look soft. You can't let it get too textured or high contrast, but then you also want it to have a specific formation and solid edges and noticeable colors and vibrance. And that's when it hit me. The petals of a flower are essentially fabric. Because this is how clothing behaves. You have structure from the density of the fabric, but then the softness and translucence from the texture of it. Flowers are clothing. And now when we look at a flower through the lens of it being some stems with a little bit of fabric on, it starts to make so much more sense. So to test my theory, I first grabbed a reference of a white magnolia. If we look at the petals here, it looks like stiff, opaque, smooth, white cloth. There's very defined edges and folds. The light bounces off it just like it would off of, say, linen. I started by sketching out a rough estimate of the shapes for these petals, and since there's just a black background, it was quick work to flat it in. I also took a moment to try and put together a palette based on the colors that are most different to each other and appear most frequently in the reference. Next, I went in and quickly painted the center, starting with what I now know is the stamens, the little white bits at the bottom, and the carpels, the squiggly squid leg looking things on top. Nothing too dramatic about this, just really trying to replicate what I saw. This video is about the petals, so let's now tackle the petals. I started with the simplest central petal, blocking it with a pale mid-tone. Now we're going to start thinking of it as a piece of linen that's been sort of steamed into having a rounded belly and a point up top. So I started by painting in the highlight from the tip down, following the curvature of the form. There's some warmth on the outside, and right at the bottom of the petal it has an attachment point. We'll paint that extra fold later. For now, let's do the petal furthest away. This one was easy. If you can imagine a piece of stiff cloth, or even paper for that matter, that's forming a concave, but the outermost edges are sort of creasing away from you a little. The shadows start to make sense. In fact, since this is a white flower, it was also a great practice for low contrast rendering. You want visible edges, but you don't want it looking too harsh. An interesting layer. And the rest of the flower was essentially the same process. Personally, I found it way easier to do one petal at a time, thinking of each one as a little piece of steamed linen that has been formed and folded in very specific ways. A lot of people who paint flowers tend to gradually build up the whole thing all at once. I am not one of those people. That feels entirely overwhelming to me. Doing them one at a time felt way simpler because I got to focus on establishing the form and seeing how the petals fold in some places and out in others. Plus, establishing the color palette in advance really helped me incorporate the color variation, like the slight warmth in some of those shadows and the cooler highlight tones. This way, I know for sure that the end product isn't going to look grey or one-dimensional in terms of the colour. Flowers need to be lively and gentle and attractive. That's what we're aiming for. I have to apologize because I lost the entire rest of the clips for this piece because we have had power outages like you wouldn't believe. But the rest of the process was the exact same thing. You're not missing out on much, just with different shapes and forms. So here's the first flower. It wasn't too insanely difficult, it looks believable, but I'm not quite satisfied that we've learned all there is to learn yet. Let's kick it up a notch. Alright, this time I wanted to play around with Nuance. I picked this reference of an almond blossom and I just wanted to focus on this one flower because not only do we have color variation, the petals are a lot thinner, meaning we have bigger, more noticeable, but more gradual value shifts. We have some translucence and we have visible veins that follow the curves and form of the petals. It's absolutely perfect as a reference. I started with just the most basic sketch, and since we only have 5 petals and they're roughly the same size, it was really just about imagining a circle and splitting it into 5 pizza slices. And now I want pizza. Ugh, I've just had dinner and now I want pizza. Curse you, delicious analogies. Anyway, I didn't bother sketching in the statements just because it's mostly just a curve and a dot. We can just eyeball it later. I'm gonna be honest, one of the big reasons I picked this reference in particular is that it had that blurry background that I don't hand paint enough in my usual art. So it was interesting to study vague colors and values without harsh edges. I thought it would be super difficult, but it was actually a lot of fun to paint. Was I procrastinating painting the actual flower? Shh, we don't need to talk about that right now. I went around the canvas getting the background in place, and then, as promised, I eyeballed the little central bits. Doesn't need to be perfect, we'll go back and paint over it later. And again, our focus is the petals anyway. So then, just like with the first flower, I started by setting up a color palette of the main values, hues, and saturation. And again, like with the first flower, we're gonna go petal by petal. You gotta find ways to be overwhelmed because if the painting process stresses you out, you're never gonna wanna come back to it. And we want to keep coming back to it. I pretty much just used my chalk brush for all the rendering. I started by flattening in the lightest shade, and it's for a very specific reason. You see, these petals are translucent and they've been photographed in daylight. So when the background light hits the back of the flower, the color that comes through is going to be pale. A great way to make sure that paleness peeks through all of the shading is to put it right at the base and build up see-through layers of shadow on top of it, gradually increasing opacity in the main body of the shadow tone. See how I started with a large brush and a lighter hand while placing the midtones, then lowered the brush size and made the shadowy areas more opaque? This chalk brush has pressure opacity dynamics, so I'm not necessarily picking darker colors, but using more pressure to put more color down. And now the veins. This is where we want to start thinking of it as fabric again. Imagine if the petal was a flat piece of cloth that came pre-printed with veins on it. Then you pick it up and mold it and round out the edges. How would the veins appear? Well, they would follow along the form of the petal as you fold and sculpt it because the print isn't going anywhere. And with those in place, it really pushes the transparency of the flower. The next petal I painted was actually more in the shadow and wasn't quite as rounded, and as a result, you can even see in the reference, it appears a lot more opaque. So the base highlight tone isn't going to show through quite as much, and it's not going to be quite as pale either. Here, we rely entirely on the veining to create the illusion of translucence, because the atmospheric light is really no help. But then, once the veins are in, you definitely want to paint over them in some places. Make sure they're like invisible in the shadows and super visible in the highlights. That kind of gives us the impression that the veins are so opaque that even though light is shining through the brighter areas of the petal, the veins are still very visibly dark. It's these little nuances and imperfections that really sell realism in a painting, so we really want to be mindful of that. I also really wanted to show you guys this one petal. The complete speed paint is of course going to be on Patreon, but I wanted to show you this one because I feel like there's a lot of nuance here. Because yes, we have translucence and shadows caused by the form folding, but then we also have some brightness from the light hitting the surface directly. How do you tell the difference between the highlights caused by key light versus the highlights caused by the transparency? The answer, my friend, is in the veins. When the key light hits the surface, it bounces off the surface evenly, and so those areas have no visible veins. So that's most of this central bright area. But if you look at the brightness here on the edge, there is visible veins. That is the bits where the brightness comes from the light filtering through the petal from the back, as opposed to light bouncing off of the petal's surface from the front. So the little nuances you see in the key light area aren't veins, they're the little folds in the petal and don't necessarily go all the way through the fabric, whereas the veins are the print on the fabric, remember? That fabric analogy really makes the petals make sense to me, and that, my friends, is material transference. It is when one material is painted almost exactly like a different material. It's when everything in the universe is visually like something else in the universe, but because logically we have very different contexts for them, like logically because we know that flowers and clothing are very different things and have different functions, we never really make that connection. But when we consciously shift our perspective and start to see the textures of the objects as separate from their function, it really changes our entire worldview. So with the final edge details and finishing touches in place, I started to think, hey, maybe there's other materials where if you take context out of the way, completely different textures are painted pretty much exactly like each other. So now let's look at some other examples of material transference. Let's start with a simple sphere. We're going to paint a material sphere for skin to begin with. If you paint characters a lot, you paint skin a lot. We know what goes into skin. You have your highlights and shadows, you have that subsurface scattering that shows up nice and saturated at the edges of the shadow, but more importantly, you have freckles and pores, even some veins that peek through the surface where the skin is super translucent, like in your forearms, your eyelids, and the backs of your hands. The imperfections that really sell the texture of realistic skin. Now, say we replicate this sphere and desaturate it. Now it's a different story, because now there's texture on something that looks like a grey, hard, opaque ball. Now if we paint some random hard shadows, maybe create lots of protrusions around the outermost edges, and maybe add a bunch of highlight to really make those edges sharp and make them jut out, boom, we've just turned skin into rock. Same texture, slightly different shapes. Just like with fabric and petals, it's just freckles and veins, but it's just in grey with higher contrast. If you thought that was cool, this next one blew my mind. Now imagine a bunch of distant mountains that are covered with fog and atmospheric perspective. So they're really light and hazy in the back, and they get darker and more defined as you get closer. Now, if we also add a bit of edge lighting to define the tops, as if sunlight was hitting the peaks right up top, beautiful. Say now we duplicate this scene and really intensify and multiply those highlights. We're still following the shapes of the mountains, but we're not necessarily sticking to their form. We're basically making them seem flatter, as in they're less high and even less defined. Now it looks like a weird sort of bumpy street, but look what happens when we color the whole thing blue. Oh, would you look at that? A stormy sea. We can go in and intensify the highlights, but suddenly those mountains have turned into waves. That makes a lot of sense logically as well, because if you think about it, mountains and valleys were created by the flow of water gradually eroding the rock. Everything is everything else. We're all just a bunch of atoms in different configurations. I actually have 2 more examples for you because once I started, it was hard to stop, okay? Let's start with a brown circle, throw on some texture. Funnily enough, I used textured brushes that were for skin and for rocks. Yeah, that's some Inception level material transference right there. Anyway, say now I want to make a new layer and create these somewhat regular but not quite scaly lines. Then I make a layer underneath to really intensify those intersections. You can see where this is going. It's a dried out bark of a tree. Now there's a very good reason why I've kept the texture lines on their own layer, as well as why the intersection shadows and highlights have their own layer. Because while we have a sphere that looks like wood right now, what I want to do is duplicate it and desaturate the whole thing. We're going to get rid of the intensity layer and just work with the lines right now. I made them smaller and copied them a bunch of times to fill out the sphere, but be much smaller. Now, this is where the magic happens. To that same layer, I'm actually going to add an emboss effect. You go to Edit, Layer Style on Critter and fiddle about with the emboss settings until you get a subtle sort of indentation effect. That, my friends, is either soft leather, like on bags or jackets, or better yet, you could pass it off as elephant skin. Just an emboss effect, and it changes the entire look and feel of a wooden bark. Okay, last one, we're still sticking with wood, but this time looking at the pattern of wood when it has like knots in it, like those eye-like shapes that then become concentric in the center. I just put a stabilizer on my ink brush to create steady lines and drew them on by hand, then added a nuance layer underneath to paint the in-between spaces brighter and darker alternatingly. Again, we want to keep the lines on their own layer, but that's pretty good for wood, right? I impress myself sometimes. Now, say we get rid of the in-between layer, just keep the flat underneath and the lines on top. Say now we paint the base a dark cyan and paint the lines turquoise. If we get rid of the concentric circle bits and keep just the wavy lines, we see a different pattern emerging. Let's paint the spaces between those lines and maybe duplicate that layer. We can rotate the copy a little bit. Stay with me, it's gonna start making sense in a second. Let's darken and blur the lower layer of lines and keep the upper layer light, but blur it a little less. I then grabbed a blender brush and blended out some of those areas as well. We want to create some serious layering underneath because now we're gonna add the bit of magic that will tie it together. With a super light green, we're going to recreate those wavy lines, but this time not follow a directional flow like we did for the wood. This time we're going all over the place, adding little circles here and there, but keeping lots of space between the longer lines. And then if we intensify the blue underneath with an airbrush, oh, would you look at that? Sea foam! I know it was a lot of alteration for this one, but when I saw the texture of the wood on my desk, I immediately thought of seafoam. And that right there is the whole purpose of this video. It isn't just to show you how to paint a bunch of materials and textures, but rather to hopefully get you to see textures differently. Because now when you look at something around you, you might be able to separate its texture from its function and maybe imagine it in a different context with slightly different colors. And maybe if you know how to paint one thing, you already know how to paint a bunch of other things, but the only block is your brain hyper-focusing on the context of it all. When we shift our attention from the meaning of things and just look at the surface level, we're starting to shift our understanding of art itself. Because, like I always say, art is in the process. The painting is just a byproduct of art. And by consciously using this idea of material transference, we're very mindfully shifting our focus from the end product to the painting process. And that right there is what keeps you coming back to paint over and over again. And now nothing will be the same, because now you've accidentally unlocked the secrets of the universe. Everything is everything else. But are there any other materials you can think of that are like other materials but slightly altered? Has this video completely changed the way you look at objects and textures? Are you tripping out a little bit? Comment below and let me know. And if you enjoyed this video and learned something today, then also let me know by giving it a big thumbs up and subscribing to my channel for loads more art content that's already on there and is coming in the future. You can support my work by buying me a coffee. That would be an awesome late birthday present, by the way, hint hint. But if you want to support my work and grab rewards every single week, you can do it by becoming a regular patron. I have a ton of stuff already on Patreon. You can instantly access all of it by becoming a patron. So link is up here in the cards and in the description. And thank you for supporting an actual human artist. If you're looking for another video that will completely change the way you paint and just completely upgrade how you look at rendering, check out this video down here where we took a look at digital watercolor painting. It will blow your mind the way it blew mine. But yeah, that's about everything for today. So thank you so much for hanging out with me and for sharing this big milestone with me today. I really hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Check out that video down here and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye!